A major meeting on biodiversity in Geneva. What are the big challenges ahead to safeguard nature? Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu, and this is The Heat. A big international meeting on biodiversity that took place over the last 2 weeks in Geneva has wrapped up with further talks set for June in Kenya. About 1,000 negotiators from 160 countries discussed major issues ahead of the UN Convention on Biodiversity that's expected to take place later this year in Kunming, China. It's hoped that countries can ratify a deal at COP15 in Kunming that will protect about 1 million plant and animal species now threatened with extinction. Another goal being discussed is to protect at least 30% of land and sea by 2030. Let's bring in our panel to talk about all of this. Joining me now from Virginia is Changhua Wu. She is the CEO of the Beijing Future Innovation Center. With us too from Washington, D.C. is Sweta Chakraborty. She is a risk and behavioral scientist and is President of U.S. operations We Don't Have Time. Also with us from Sao Paulo, Brazil is Carlos Joly. He is Emeritus Professor at the University of Campinas. And also with us is Elizabeth Karan. She is Project Director for Ocean Life on the High Seas at the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Sweta, let me start with you. After 2 weeks of talks in Geneva, it looks like we're headed for more talks now that'll take place in Nairobi in Kenya later this year. And all that, of course, is ahead of that conference in Kunming, China, the COP15 conference, which is expected to take place later this year. But what are your thoughts on the talks that took place in Geneva? Could more have been accomplished?
Definitely more could have been accomplished, but this is the equivalent, the biodiversity equivalent of the Paris Accords. And these goals need to be ambitious and they need to be thoroughly sketched out. So let's take the time to outline exactly what those goals are. And the indication coming out of Geneva is that we need to get to 30% protection of land and animals by 2030. And we hear similar sentiments across the grand climate ambitions that we have in reaching net neutral by 2050 to keep runaway temperature warming to max out at 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So the goals that are coming out of these talks really need to simultaneously support the grander climate ambitions that were outlined in the Paris Accords. So let's take the time to make sure that we get it right. We are in our 6th mass extinction. We need to stave off 1 million species from going extinct, and we need to find the resources to do this. And it's not that we don't have the resources. We know coming out of these talks that we need to increase spending by 200 billion annually to 2030 to make sure we reach those goals of protecting 30% of land and animals by 2030. We can redirect the 6 trillion almost that is being subsidizing the oil and gas industry. There is money out there, and we need to count on investors and money managers to redirect capital away from those companies that produced risks in nature, rather redirect them to regeneration projects. So it's really critical now that we get this right.
So, Sweta, we are hearing about the goals of this conference, but are we hearing much about strategies to achieve them?
Well, we know that we need to see developed countries give that funding to developed countries around $20 billion. Again, this is a drop in the bucket compared to what reports have previously said are required to really stave off this extinction that we are experiencing. So something like 700 billion needs to come out of these talks to really reach our goals. So to say that we have to get 200 billion annually and that developing countries need to produce 20 billion to help support developed countries' initiatives should be manageable. Again, it's a matter of redirecting our resources. Currently, our resources are fueling a dirty war, Russia's dirty war in Ukraine, and they are being used to line the pockets of oil executives. We can redirect those subsidies to actually preserve the one planet that we all know and live on. So that is really what the realization has been coming out of these talks. How do we redirect those resources and reach these ambitious goals?
Changhua Wu, as Sweta just told us a moment ago, COP15, according to many analysts, should deliver for us what the Paris Accord delivered for climate change. What do you still hope can be achieved in Kunming?
Well, more than 1,000 delegates, negotiators from different parts of the world, and left Geneva with a so-called clean text, but with many, many brackets in it. So now the baton is passed to Nairobi, hoping somehow one more week of negotiation in Nairobi in June, in late June, we'll be able to, if not removing all the brackets in the current, the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, the draft, at least many of them should be somehow removed, so that when everyone actually getting to Kunming in late August or September, somehow with a further negotiation, we will be able to have, clearly set, sort of developed a framework for global actions to address nature conservation, protection, and biodiversity protection there as well. So now a lot of people are very sort of critical of the Geneva process. And I am a mixed sort of with, on one side, of course, but I am optimistic that the desire, the aspiration remains, even from the 2 weeks of talks in Geneva, that everyone's still agreeing on the sense of urgency, the sense of crisis, the scale of the crisis, and also the sense of urgency of actions, collective actions there. But then on the pessimistic side, actually, it's so difficult actually for negotiators from different parts of the world to agree on the specifics, including sector-specific targets, as well as resources, where to mobilize the resources, not only financial resources, but also technology, technical resources, capacity building, you name it. We need all resources together to be put together, in order to address the challenges, which literally, as Greta mentioned correctly, we are living in the sixth, mass extinction age. This is about ourselves. It's not just about nature, it's about human survival as a species in the planetary system.
Elizabeth, Karan, welcome to the show. Great to have you with us. We often hear that climate change poses an existential threat to us on the planet, to the planet itself. But let's talk about your area of expertise, which is maritime protection. Tell us about the major challenges in that particular area.
Sure. Well, I think one of the major challenges about the ocean is that we can't even see what's going on. And so it's easy to ignore a threat that we can't even see. A lot of the what's going on in the oceans, pollution, plastics pollution, biodiversity loss, overfishing, is happening beneath the surface, but with great impacts. The Food and Agriculture Organization statistics from recent years show that over 1/3 of fish species are overfished. The recent UN IPCC report on climate change showed that the ocean, as a result of climate change, the oceans are getting warmer, they're getting the salinity, they're getting saltier, and the oxygen is decreasing. And when that oxygen is decreasing, the marine life is declining as a result. We see this with sea ice in the Arctic melting and Antarctic ice sheets melting and fresh water flooding into the oceans and changing, again, the very chemistry that is supporting life in the oceans. And this is truly an existential threat, not just for the marine life that call the ocean their homes, but also for us that depend on ocean resources for food security and for other ecosystem services.
Elizabeth, we were talking a moment ago about some of the strategies that are being put in place to preserve biodiversity on Earth, but specifically as far as marine protection is concerned, what are we seeing there?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest tools that we have in our toolbox for conservation in the marine space are marine protected areas. And that is one of the targets being negotiated under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the framework, the post-2020 framework, the so-called 30 by 30 goal, so that to protect at least 30% of the land and sea by 2030. And scientists show for the oceans that at least 30% protections are needed in order to ensure a sustainable, healthy ocean. And so what we're hoping for out of this target out of this framework is to see that target come to fruition. We've already seen over 100 countries through the High Ambition Coalition for Nature, which is led by Costa Rica and France, and the Global Ocean Alliance, led by the United Kingdom, that committed to this goal. And so what we'd like to see, though, is be a legally binding target through the CBD.
Carlos, Joly, welcome to the show. Great to have you as well here. Let's talk about the Amazon. You are in Brazil right now. We often hear the Amazon being described as the lungs of the planet, but we've also heard with concern over the past few years about fires destroying large tracts of the Amazon rainforest. How important is it that the Amazon be preserved, and what are the status of efforts right now to do that?
Well, the protection of the Amazon is extremely important for the survival of the planet as we know the planet today. It's not the lung of the planet, but it's of extreme importance on climate regulation and extremely important in terms of biodiversity. We are talking about a forest that have about 15,000 species of trees. In 1 hectare, you may have more trees than you have in UK as a whole, species different. So unfortunately, the present government is not doing enough or is doing very little to protect the forest. The protection that we are having are coming from state governments, and we really need a change, a complete change in the way of leading with environment for us to have the forest well protected. There is a lot of effort going on the scientific arena, but it's not going on the governmental arena. So we are increasing our knowledge, we are increasing to know what needs to be done, and we are hoping that we are going to have a new government. We have general elections in October, and with that we may have a change in the way the environment is being treated. So if we don't protect the forest, we are not only losing those species, but we are also losing the way of living of about 25 million people that live on the forest. And they live from the forest, keeping the forest and using products from the forest to survive. They can teach us a lot about sustainable use of the forest. And this is not only for Brazil, but for the other countries that make up the whole of the Amazon region. So we have to learn and to hear them. Otherwise, we may be among those 1 million species threatened by the end of the century. I think us, by the human species.
Carlos, in addition to there being a change in government policy, what can be done on the ground to change what is happening in the Amazon in terms of things like education, like diversifying the economy away from what is being done in the Amazon right now?
That's what we've been working on. The research and working together with traditional knowledge and indigenous knowledge to be ready to start as soon as we have a change in terms of the views that we have from the government. It's not only the fire that's the problem in the Amazon. Fire is the one that you can see on TV, but we have illegal gold mining. This is a terrible problem because you have a lot of mercury that's being thrown in the water, contaminating the water, not only for the fishes and the species that live in the water, but also for everyone that is eating those fishes or using that water for their needs in terms of drinking, or cook, or to. So we've been working. We've been taking schools, especially schools, academic schools, to discuss within the Amazon region. Last year there was a panel, a scientific panel on the Amazon that published quite a lot on it. So we know what we do.
Right.
We need support.
Okay. Sweta, I want to get back to the 2030 goals that you were talking about earlier on. The idea is to preserve at least 30% of land and sea by the year 2030. Tell us more about that.
So this is not just a feel-good ambition. Of course, we want to save the species that we have come to know and love, but there is actual ecological security risks associated with not preserving nature and not coming up with nature-based solutions to the risks that we're collectively facing here. There's also economic losses to be realized. We know that half of the world's economic activity is highly or moderately dependent on nature. That is 44 trillion in global GDP. So this is imperative for the business bottom line to protect the nature from which business is derived. So there are companies, and the reason I'm saying this is because we need companies and private sector to really mobilize to be able to see these 2030 ambitions realized. And there are companies that are really applying nature-based solutions to solving this grave threat to nature. Like Terraformation is an example of a company that is sourcing native seeds for the replanting of native plants. And the reason that this is so critical is because we need to reforest, because forests are natural carbon sinks. And this allows for the prevention of that runaway global temperature warming. All of this is really interlinked. We are not, if we do not get to preserving 30% of land and sea by 2030, we will not reach our targets for keeping the planet warming less than 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. To reach that target, we need to make sure we're net neutral by mid-century, which means there's a lot of things that need to happen by 2030, by the end of this decade. And number one in that is preserving land and sea. These things are inextricably linked.
Changhua Wu, how much of an overlap is there between climate change and biodiversity, and how vital is it for both of these challenges to be confronted at the same time?
Well, the two are very much interlinked with each other. I think last year at the climate COP, Glasgow COP26, for the first time, nature, ecosystem, and agriculture were brought to such a high level at, climate COP, summit there. That tells you the significance of the interconnection, interdependence of nature and the climate change. And I think as we're talking about here, nature itself, of course, is the biggest carbon sink. Basically say yes, and when we do talk about clean renewable energy, whatever, but the ocean and land, the forest, the ecosystems are pretty much the biggest carbon sink. And so when we clear the forest, when we disrupt the ocean, wetlands, you name the land ecosystems there, we pretty much sort of compromising tremendously and the capability of carbon sink of nature itself. Then on the other side, of course, nature also provides huge resilience. And we talk about wetlands, right? Nature, ecosystem regulating the water flow of nature. And as we all know, the biggest disruptor or consequence of climate change is the disruption of the water cycle. So nature itself is pretty much, it's a bigger system. But if you come down to biodiversity, climate system, whatever, so all the systems are pretty much part of the nature, the planetary boundary there we are talking about here. So they are pretty much linked with each other. I think that's also why, not only at Glasgow COP26, but also in Geneva, the COP15 of CBD, these two issues are closely linked when people negotiate about the targets, about resource mobilization, about capacity technology solutions there, even about indicators, metrics there, and those are two. You cannot possibly separate the two basically on two different fronts. Rather, they are in it together. On one side, that's great because we're talking about the co-benefits, connectivity there. Then on the other side, it does add the level of complexity to the negotiation process because as far as we know, it's relatively easier to agree upon principles, right? A sense of urgency, the narratives there. The most difficult part actually for negotiation is about specifics, right? We're talking about everything here, right? It's cascading, so it's about nature, agriculture, food, mining, all the economic sectors there. I think that's where the most challenging part lies in today.
Elizabeth, you were telling us a moment ago that one of the challenges of the threat that faces the threat in the oceans, that faces marine life, is the fact that it's out of sight. It's below the surface of the ocean. But there is one threat which we see in full view, and that is the threat posed by plastics. We see plastics on the surface, we see it on the ocean, we see it on beaches, we see it at river mouths, in bays, in harbors, etc. What impact is that having on marine life right now?
Yeah, it's having a tremendous impact, and not just on marine life. I think there have been studies that show that microplastics are in our human blood. So this is an issue that goes beyond the oceans, but I think that the oceans has made it really visible and visceral for people, in the sense that you think you're throwing your plastic container into the garbage or the recycling can, only to see it in these huge garbage patches or gyres out in the middle of the ocean, out in the high seas, actually, in areas beyond national jurisdiction, which currently there's a parallel process going on at the UN to negotiate a treaty to protect the biodiversity there that is also hoping to be completed in August of this year. So this would complement the 2030 biodiversity framework that's being discussed, and the 30 by 30 targets there. But I think that Pew released a report recently called "Breaking the Plastics Wave." It showed that on average 11 million metric tons of plastic plastic waste is found goes into the ocean every year, and that is a tremendous problem. Fortunately, earlier this month, the United Nations has also taken action to start a new treaty negotiations to address this plastics problem. And so we're hopeful that in the coming years there will be an additional agreement to address not just plastics in the oceans, but the plastic problem more generally.
Carlos, one of the biggest challenges facing developing countries is the big debate over climate change versus preserving the environment. We see that particularly in Brazil, where we see loggers squaring off with environmentalists. How does one address that?
Yeah, I think that, as has been said, those agendas are imbricated. I mean, you cannot discuss climate change without discussing biodiversity, and the other way around. I think that the way of going forward is that if we have the amount of technological and development that we need to actually implement some of the solutions, as been said, as nature-based solution. This is something that is ongoing, that we've learned how to do with two of our main forests, the Atlantic forest and the Amazon forest. But this, one hand, can be very expensive. On the other hand, it might not sequester so much carbon as the models are telling us. So to go forward, we really need to work together to have an interdisciplinary approach to the problems and try to bring the communities together.
Sweta, we often hear about tipping points when we talk about climate change, but are there potential tipping points when we talk about biodiversity, about the fight to preserve biodiversity?
Absolutely. We don't want to see the natural order of things detrimentally affected because of bad human behaviors, and we can't even begin to predict what the planet is going to look like, really, if we start seeing species across the entire chain of interaction. If we start losing those species, what does that mean for the way that we coexist with animals on the planet? It's a scary thought, and we want to stave off those worst case scenarios. We can get ahead of it now. We can encourage companies to become environmental stewards. Regulations are doing that in the U.S. and abroad, and it's going to increasingly become unattractive to support or buy from or engage with companies that are not using their companies' investments to support staving off biodiversity loss. And as consumers, that is something that we can directly do to ensure that we are engaging with companies that are good environmental stewards. So everyone has a role to play here to stave off those worst case scenarios, so we never have to talk about those tipping points. That is a future I do not want to think about, and there is still significant time between now and the end of this decade to preserve and protect 30% of land and sea so we can avoid those worst case scenarios.
Changhua Wu, what are some of the things that China is doing right now to preserve biodiversity? I know there's a big effort on forestation.
Absolutely. I think as COP15 presidency, China definitely takes on a unique, special, timely role in terms of really accelerating its own domestic actions to protect the nature. So if you look at the whole territory, particularly, if you look at the land, talk about land ecosystems there, the whole territory has been divided into different zones based on the the health of the ecosystem today, and as well as the services there. So you started to see areas already protected. And even though probably it's not 30% today, but it's pretty much more than 20% already. And hopefully there will be more, right? And there are vulnerable, sort of already degraded areas there. So then you started to see restoration, remediation efforts, basically top-down driven efforts with national plans for local governments actually taking the actions with the time-bound targets there as well. And then, of course, you have other areas there. So you started to see that sort of the country, the policymakers in China started really to mainstream, put the integrity of the ecosystem to all the policy-making process. I said that direction, the vision is already clearly seen, witnessed already in China, but of course the efforts takes much more time.
Elizabeth, can you give us a sense of how committed the United States is to the preservation of biodiversity, and how would this be financed?
Sure. So last year, President Biden signed an executive order that sets an ambitious goal for the United States to protect at least 30% of its lands, national lands and waters, by 2030. Center for American Progress put out a report that shows that currently the U.S. protects about 12% of land and 23% of its waters. And of the waters protection number, a large portion of that is through the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument in the Pacific. So there's much more work to be done domestically, but the U.S. is committed to this national target, and while it's not a member of the Convention on Biological Diversity, it is an active player, an influential player in those negotiations. And so I think it has an opportunity. It's set a standard that other countries can follow nationally, but it also has recently recognized the need for this target to be global. So not just one that is adopted by every country, but also one that 30 by 30 target that extends into the high seas. Pointing to the ecological connectivity issues that other speakers have mentioned here. National, wildlife in the ocean doesn't respect these artificial borders that we created. So, what happens in the high seas affects fish that people depend on in the nearshore areas, and vice versa.
Well, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.